Hey guys, today I'm going to teach y'all about the box model in CSS and HTML and the display property. And it will answer the question of where exactly do elements begin and end. Um, all elements in HTML are squares or boxes. Even if they don't look like squares, the browser sees them as squares. What you see is the red part, or the content. It has a height and width, and the height and width properties in CSS specifically affect the content portion of the element, but there's also three other portions that are not affected by that height and width property. There's the padding, which is in between the border and the content. There's the border itself, which is factored into the size of the element. And then there's the margin, which is on the outside of the element, outside of the border and the padding. Um, By default, most elements have a margin size of 8 pixels and a border and padding size of 0 pixels. So if you want it to have any value other than that, you're going to have to specify it in CSS directly. And if you set the background color or background image, that is going to color the padding, but not the border or the margin. The display property determines how the elements will be arranged on the page in relation to each other. Um, the values we'll learn about today, even though there are more than this, we'll just learn about these four: block, inline block, and none. The display block value makes elements have their own line on the page. Um, this makes it so that every element takes up the entire width of its container, whatever its container ends up being. An inline element, however, is able to be in a line with other elements, so they don't take up the entire width of their container, and they're able to sit next to other elements. However, this means that you cannot change their height and width properties. Their height and width are automatically shrunk to as small as they can be, so that the element can be in a line with other elements and be as small as possible. Inline block is a combination of these two. So it is able to sit next to other elements in a horizontal line, but their width and height can be changed. None makes an element disappear, and it only takes up a tiny amount of space. It will still take up a tiny amount of space. It won't take up no space at all, unfortunately. Some of my students found that out the hard way, but it will, for the most part, not appear. Um, JavaScript changes these properties to create drop-down menus and buttons that appear and disappear, and so on and so forth. Let me show you guys some visuals on what that might look like. So if all elements are boxes, I can just draw you guys some boxes, and those will represent elements. So say we have a container right here. This is a container for an element, and it will contain three other elements. Say this container contains three other elements, and these other elements will be blue. If they're inline elements, they will be created like this. If they're pretty small, they'll be about like that. Notice how there's a tiny space in between each one. That would be the margin. So right there, that little space in between your boxes is the margin. That keeps the elements away from each other so they're not right next to each other. You can take that away and they will be right next to each other. Sometimes that makes things look really interesting. So these are inline elements. Here's what a block level element would look like. If we were to change these elements to block level elements, we're gonna have to make room for three of those guys. So there's element 1, there's element 2. They'd actually be a lot bigger than this. They take up the whole width of their container. There's element 1, there's element 2, and there's element 3. Notice how they each take up one whole width of their container and they're a lot bigger. So that's the difference when you change something from inline to block. It looks like this. You still have the margins, but the margins are now separating it vertically rather than horizontally. Now, what if this container were to change size? If we were to shrink the container, that's the black box, then the elements that don't fit would pop outside of the container. Um, but maybe we might want these elements to stay there. We might want them to always be the same width as the container, no matter how big the container is. Um, in that case, we would use what's called responsive programming or responsive design, which allows elements to resize themselves based on the size of the window. So what that looks like is instead of saying with a certain number of pixels, you would say with a certain number of percentage of its container. So in the second example, when we have display, let me put these back. This is display inline. We wouldn't be able to change the height and width of the top elements because we're using display inline and that doesn't allow you to change the height and width, but we can with the bottom ones because they're display block. Say we wanted them to only be 50% of the width of this container. We only wanted them to take up half the width of their container. But we don't know how big the container is. If the container was always the same size, if the container was 200 pixels wide, we could say width 100 pixels. But if the container changes shape, then that doesn't apply anymore. So we can use a percentage value instead. 50% is then 50% of the width of its container. So if we were to change that, they now only take up half of the width of their container. The other half of the container is empty. And if you change the width of the container, the elements inside the container will change their width as well. And this is really useful for if you want menus to change their size if the window changes size as well. This is a great way to make websites look really polished. So a good way to practice this is by making elements align themselves inside of a container. And I'm going to have you guys practice this by creating a penguin. So I have pieces of a penguin on my website. My website is margaretbguzman.com. If you click on Student Portal, by the way, my menu is responsive. Notice how the buttons on the menu resize themselves based on how big my window is. These are responsive menu buttons. So you click on Student Portal, click on round 3, and you'll find the pieces of the penguin. To put these in your page, you'll just copy image address and then use those for the source attributes for your images. To put these in your page, um, you want to put them in the order that you would put them if you were typing them out in a text document. For example, HTML lays out elements as if they were letters in a text document. So if you just put the elements in order, say H for head, B for body, LA for left arm, RA for right arm, F for feet. We could list them in that order, and then maybe put a line break here. No, right here. Because we want the head to be on a line by itself. The body, the left arm, and the right arm will all be on a line together, and the feet will be on a line by themselves. So these elements are separate elements, and because they're in a line next to each other, they cannot be in line block, or they cannot be displayed block because they have to be in a line next to each other. The head can, the feet can, but the body and the left arm and the right arm cannot. Also, they're not rearranged correctly. We don't want the body and the left arm and the right arm. We want them to be in the other way around. So we'll do left arm, then body, then right arm. Then the head and the feet are not lined up to the body. So to line them up to the body, we'll have to put a space to the left of the head and the feet, which means you'll have to add a margin just to the left, not to the top, just to the left. And you can do this. There's a property in CSS called margin left. And instead of setting this to a pixel value, we'll set this to a percentage of the container so that as we resize the window, all of the images will resize themselves, but also the spaces next to the images as well, so that the images don't become out of place when we resize the window. So let me show you guys in Paint the overall structure of how the penguin will be laid out. Okay, so we'll have a container to hold all of the parts of the penguin together. This container holds all the parts of the penguin. Then we'll have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 elements that are each the parts of the penguin. We have the head here. That's the head. The body will go right underneath the head. The feet will go right underneath the body. The right arm will go to the right of the body. The left arm will go to the left of the body. I just made this a little too big, so let me resize the container. If I were to just put these elements inside the container without doing anything else, it would just put the head here and the feet here. So in order to make it put the head and the feet where we want it to go, we'd have to change the left margin to move the head and the feet to the right. And in order to make sure that no elements go next to the head, because it'll start putting the left arm right next to the head and then the body, and since there won't be any room for the right arm, it would put the right arm here, and it would start just listing them in the order that you list them. So to put the head by itself, we'll need to put display block for the head and the feet, and display inline for, well, inline block so that we can change its height and width for the hands and the feet. And then once we've done that, we can shift the head and the feet to the right by using the margin left property. So we'll be shifting these guys to the right. By how much? That's a good question. Um, we have to use a responsive value because we don't want it to not always be the same. If we resize this container, we want the whole penguin to be resized at the same rate. So if you look this way, horizontally, this empty space takes up about a third of the height. The body and the arms take up about a third of the height, and this empty space takes up about a third of the height. So each of the elements' heights must be about 30% or 1/3. The same goes for the other way. On the whole thing, the margin left should be around 30%, which is a little less than a third of the container. The width of each of these elements should be about 1/3 of their container. And you don't need to specify margin right because um, that will automatically be empty due to the fact that this element has display block. All right, take a moment to try that out for yourselves, and then I will show the answer. All right, here's what your finished penguin should look like. The body element is right here. This paragraph element is completely optional. I just put it in there for fun. This div element starts here and ends right here. So it contains 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 image elements. That contains the whole penguin. So when I resize this window, the penguin resizes with it because the container and the elements inside the container are responsive. And CSS is doing this. If I unlink the CSS by briefly removing the line of code that links the style sheet, you guys can see how that completely destroys the penguin. Now HTML is just putting them in order however they fit. It's not resizing them. It's just putting them like letters in a Word document however they fit. It's CSS that makes them stay together. So I have an image element, and in order to specify each of them separately, because we can't just use the image selector in CSS because they're all image elements, but we want to give them each separate style rules. So we gave them an attribute called ID, which is very useful for both CSS and JavaScript, which is a unique identifier for an element. In order to select a specific element in CSS, here, let me put my CSS file right here. I can then select that specific element by using hashtag and then the ID of the element in the selector. So for the head, I've set it to display block so that the arms and body cannot be next to it. Margin left, I set it to slightly less than 30 so that the head would not be offset from the body. Height and width, I set it to slightly more than 30% so the penguin's head would look a little bit larger and give it a kind of a cute appearance. The feet, I decided to make a little bit larger as well. Margin left is a little bit less than 30% at 25%, and it's also display block. The body, right arm and left arm, I did not need to change the display property because elements are naturally, image elements are naturally display inline. unless you specify otherwise. So all we had to change was the height and width properties to make them a responsive percentage value instead of a very rigid pixel value. This selector actually selects nothing because there is no element that has the ID of penguin. I had this div have an ID of penguin before, but I deleted that. So now that style rule set has no purpose. So I'm taking it out. You can change these numbers around a little bit to adjust the size of your penguin, but generally this is how it's going to work. To make sure it works, resize your window and make sure your penguin resizes with it. If it doesn't, that means it's not responding properly, it's not properly responsive. If you want, you can have some fun with it by changing the images. I've had some people do like a cat face and a bodybuilder body. That was pretty funny. There's lots of ways to have fun with this. And once you are finished, have fun. I'll see you next time.